In the small, dusty town of Pecos, Texas, life moved at a slow pace. The sun hung high in the sky, casting long shadows over the cracked sidewalks and weathered storefronts. It was here, amidst the quiet hum of everyday life, that an unassuming man walked into a used car lot on a warm Tuesday afternoon. With his cowboy hat pulled low and dark sunglasses shielding his eyes, no one recognized him as Chuck Norris, the legendary martial artist, actor, and cultural icon. To the people around him, he was just another customer looking for a reliable ride. Chuck had recently retired from Hollywood after decades of thrilling audiences with his incredible stunts and larger-than-life persona. Tired of the spotlight, he decided to trade the glitz and glamour of Los Angeles for the simple charm of rural living. In Pecos, he found peace, rolling hills, friendly neighbors, and a sense of anonymity that allowed him to live without constant attention. But there was one problem. His trusty old truck, which had served him faithfully for years, had finally given up the ghost. Its engine sputtered and wheezed like an old dog trying to catch its breath, leaving Chuck stranded more times than he cared to admit. Determined to find a replacement, Chuck stepped onto the sun-baked asphalt of the car lot, scanning rows of vehicles, in various states of disrepair. Some looked like they hadn't seen a wash in years, while others sported patches of rust so large they resembled modern art. Despite their condition, each vehicle carried a sticker with a price tag that seemed suspiciously optimistic. Chuck raised an eyebrow but kept walking, knowing full well that bargains often came with strings attached. A slick-talking salesman approached him almost immediately, flashing a grin as wide as the Texas horizon. "Mornin', stranger," the man drawled, tipping his own hat. "Name's Ray. What brings you to our little corner of paradise?" "I need a truck," Chuck replied simply, his voice calm and measured. "Something dependable." Ray nodded enthusiastically, already sizing up his potential buyer. He gestured toward a row of vehicles and began rattling off options, pointing out features with exaggerated enthusiasm. "Well, sir, we've got plenty to choose from. Trucks for hauling, trucks for towing, trucks for, well, just about anything you can think of." Chuck listened patiently, letting Ray ramble on about horsepower and torque. As they wandered through the lot, one particular truck caught Chuck's eye. A beat-up pickup with faded paint and dents that told stories of hard work and tough roads. It wasn't flashy, but it had character. Something about it felt familiar, like an old friend waiting to be rediscovered. "How much for this one?" Chuck asked, nodding toward the truck. Ray hesitated for a moment, scratching his chin as if deep in thought. Then, with a sly smile, he said, "Tell you what, I'll make you a deal you can't refuse. $800, cash only." The price was absurdly low, even by used car standards. Chuck narrowed his eyes slightly behind his sunglasses, sensing that something wasn't quite right. Still, he didn't say anything. Instead, he circled the truck slowly, inspecting it from every angle. The tires were worn but still usable, and the engine started with a reassuring rumble when Ray turned the key. For all its flaws, the truck seemed solid enough to get the job done. "Fair warning," Ray added casually, leaning against the hood. "She ain't perfect, but she'll get you where you need to go. Just don't expect her to win any beauty contests." Chuck chuckled softly, appreciating the honesty, or at least the appearance of it. He knew better than to trust anyone completely, especially someone selling cars. But something about the truck called to him, as if it had a story to tell. Maybe it was the way the sunlight glinted off its battered surface, or maybe it was the faint scent of motor oil lingering in the air. Whatever it was, Chuck decided to take a chance. "All right," he said finally, pulling a wad of cash from his pocket. "I'll take it." Ray's grin widened as he accepted the money, shaking Chuck's hand with gusto. "You won't regret it, partner. This baby's got miles left in her." As Chuck climbed into the driver's seat and adjusted the rearview mirror, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just made more than a simple purchase. There was something about the truck, an aura of mystery perhaps, that hinted at secrets hidden beneath its rough exterior. For now, though, he pushed those thoughts aside and focused on the road ahead. Little did he know, this humble pickup would soon lead him down a path filled with danger, intrigue, and revelations beyond anything he could have imagined. With a gentle press of the accelerator, Chuck pulled out of the car lot and headed home, unaware that his new truck held far more than just a few dents and scratches. Hidden within its steel frame lay clues to a shadowy world, one that would test his courage, resourcefulness, and determination in ways he never expected. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon as Chuck drove his newly purchased truck down a winding country road. The sky transformed into shades of orange and pink, painting the landscape with a warm glow. Despite the beauty surrounding him, Chuck couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something about this truck wasn't quite right. At first it had seemed like nothing more than an old, slightly banged-up vehicle, a reliable workhorse for his quiet life in Pecos. But now, as he listened closely to the hum of the engine and the subtle creaks of the cabin, he realized there was more going on beneath the surface. It started with a faint noise, a rhythmic tapping sound that didn't match the rhythm of the tires hitting the pavement. At first, Chuck dismissed it as loose parts or perhaps rocks caught in the undercarriage. But as the miles passed, the sound grew louder and more insistent, almost like a heartbeat pulsing through the metal frame. He glanced at the dashboard, checking for warning lights, but everything appeared normal. Still, curiosity gnawed at him, urging him to investigate further. When he finally arrived home, Chuck parked the truck in his driveway and stepped out, closing the door with a solid thud. He walked around the vehicle, inspecting it once again, from every angle. The dents and scratches told tales of hard use, but nothing unusual stood out. Satisfied that the exterior gave no clues, Chuck popped the hood and leaned in to examine the engine. To his trained eye, everything looked functional. No frayed wires, no leaks, no signs of tampering. Yet the mysterious tapping persisted, muffled but unmistakable. Frowning, Chuck climbed back into the cab and sat down, running his hands along the worn leather seats. That's when he noticed something odd near the passenger seat. A small seam ran along the base of the seat, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. It wasn't part of the original design. Someone had added it later, carefully crafting it to blend in with the rest of the upholstery. His instincts kicked in and he pressed gently against the seam, feeling resistance beneath his fingers. A hidden compartment. Chuck's pulse quickened. Hidden compartments weren't uncommon in trucks. They were often used by hunters or outdoorsmen to store tools or supplies. But something about this one felt different. For starters, it was expertly concealed, almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. And then there was the fact that it wouldn't budge. He tried pulling on it, twisting it, even prying at it with his pocket knife, but the latch refused to open. It wasn't locked. It felt like it had been welded shut from the inside. Undeterred, Chuck decided to apply a bit more force. Using both hands, he gripped the edge of the compartment and pushed downward with steady pressure. There was a soft click, followed by a metallic groan as the seal broke. Slowly the compartment opened, revealing nothing, or so it seemed. Inside, the space was empty, except for a thin layer of dust and a few faint scuff marks along the edges. The air carried a faint smell of oil, sharp and industrial, suggesting that whatever had been stored here hadn't been idle. For a moment, Chuck sat motionless, staring into the hollow space. His mind raced with possibilities. Had the previous owner used this compartment to hide valuables? Was it meant for smuggling goods? Or was it simply a clever modification gone unused? Whatever the case, the craftsmanship behind it spoke volumes. Someone had gone to great lengths to ensure this compartment remained undetectable, which meant its purpose likely wasn't innocent. As night fell, Chuck grabbed a flashlight and examined the compartment more closely. He ran his fingers over the scuff marks, noting their depth and direction. They weren't random scratches. They formed patterns, as if objects had been slid in and out repeatedly. He also noticed tiny flecks of dried grease clinging to the corners, evidence of frequent activity. This wasn't just a forgotten feature of the truck. It had been actively used, and recently. His thoughts drifted back to the car lot and Ray, the overly friendly salesman who had sold him the truck. Chuck replayed their conversation in his head, searching for any hint of deception. Ray had been eager to make the sale, practically tripping over himself to close the deal. Could he have known about the compartment? or was he merely a pawn in a larger game? Determined to get answers, Chuck made up his mind to return to the dealership the next day. But before heading inside, he wanted to test one last theory. He retrieved a screwdriver from his toolbox and began unscrewing the panel surrounding the compartment. Beneath it lay a second layer of metal, reinforced and sturdy. Whoever had installed this compartment had spared no expense, ensuring it could withstand significant weight and pressure. As Chuck worked, he uncovered additional details: wiring harnesses tucked away neatly, hints of hydraulic mechanisms designed to support heavy loads. By the time he finished his inspection, Chuck's suspicions had solidified into certainty. This truck wasn't just a means of transportation. It was a tool, crafted for a specific and secretive purpose. The question was, what kind of secrets did it hold? And why had it ended up in his possession? Sitting back on his heels, Chuck exhaled, slowly, his breath visible in the cool evening air. He had always trusted his instincts, and they were telling him loud and clear that this was no ordinary vehicle. Something, or someone, had left traces behind, and those traces led to a story far bigger than a simple used truck. Tomorrow he would confront Ray and demand answers. Until then, all he could do was wait, listen, and let the pieces fall into place. As he locked the truck and headed indoors, Chuck couldn't help but feel a spark of excitement mixed with unease. Retirement had promised him peace and simplicity, but it seemed fate had other plans. Little did he know this discovery was only the beginning of a journey that would take him far beyond the borders of Pecos and deep into a world of danger and intrigue. The next morning, Chuck woke up with a sense of purpose. The sun had barely risen, casting a golden glow over the quiet town of Pecos, but he was already dressed and ready to tackle the mystery surrounding his new truck. He knew that returning to the car lot wouldn't be enough. Ray, the salesman, might not have all the answers, or worse, he might try to cover his tracks. Chuck needed more than just a conversation. He needed evidence. And if there was one thing Chuck Norris excelled at, it was uncovering the truth. Before heading back to the dealership, Chuck decided to dig deeper into the truck's history. He grabbed a notebook and pen, jotting down key details: the make and model, the VIN number etched onto the dashboard, and any other identifying features he could find. With these notes in hand, he drove to the local library, a modest brick building nestled between a diner and a hardware store. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old books and polished wood, and rows of dusty shelves stretched toward the ceiling. Chuck approached the librarian, a kind woman with glasses perched on her nose, and asked for help accessing public records related to vehicle registrations. At first, the search seemed straightforward. Chuck scrolled through databases filled with information about cars sold, traded, and reported stolen across the state. But as he delved further, something unusual caught his attention. The VIN number on his truck didn't match the records associated with its supposed history. According to the documents, the truck had been reported stolen 2 years ago during what appeared to be a high-profile smuggling operation. Its original owner, a man named Harold Jenkins, had filed a police report claiming the vehicle disappeared from his property overnight. Stranger still, the truck reappeared months later at an auction house in Dallas, where it changed hands several times before ending up at Ray's dealership. Chuck's brow furrowed as he pieced together the timeline. Someone had gone to great lengths to erase the truck's past, altering its VIN and selling it off as though it were nothing more than a regular used vehicle. But why? What made this particular truck so valuable or dangerous? As he sifted through the files, another name kept popping up: Victor Kane. At first, Chuck dismissed it as coincidence, but the more he read, the clearer it became that Kane was connected to a string of criminal activities spanning multiple states. Described as a ruthless crime lord with ties to underground networks, Kane specialized in smuggling operations, using modified vehicles to transport illegal goods undetected. Chuck realized that the hidden compartment in his truck wasn't just a clever modification. It was part of a much larger scheme. Determined to learn more, Chuck spent hours combing through newspaper clippings, court documents, and online forums discussing Kane's exploits. One article mentioned a series of abandoned warehouses outside Odessa, Texas, where authorities believed Kane's crew operated. Though no arrests had been made, investigators suspected the locations were used for storing contraband and preparing vehicles for transport. Chuck circled the addresses in red ink, committing them to memory. If he wanted answers, he would need to see these places for himself. By late afternoon, Chuck returned to the car lot, his expression unreadable behind his sunglasses. Ray greeted him with the same wide grin he'd worn the day before, though there was a flicker of nervousness in his eyes when he saw Chuck approaching. "Hey there, partner," Ray said, tipping his hat. "How's the old girl treating you?" "She's doing fine," Chuck replied calmly, leaning against the hood of his truck. "But I did notice something interesting." "Oh yeah?" Ray asked, his smile faltering slightly. "What's that?" "There's a hidden compartment under the passenger seat," Chuck said matter-of-factly. He watched closely as Ray's face paled, his forced cheerfulness crumbling under the weight of Chuck's words. "Care to explain how it got there?" Ray stammered, clearly caught off guard. I don't know anything about that, sir. Must have been the previous owner. We just sell them as they come." Chuck nodded slowly, pretending to accept the explanation, but his sharp gaze never wavered. He let the silence hang in the air, giving Ray time to squirm. Finally, he spoke again, his tone deceptively casual. "You know, I looked into the truck's history. Turns out it was stolen a couple years back. Ever heard of a guy named Victor Kane?" The name hit Ray like a punch to the gut. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard, sweat forming on his forehead despite the cool breeze. "No, can't say I have," he muttered, avoiding eye contact. Chuck didn't press further. He had learned enough to confirm his suspicions. Ray might not have known the full extent of the truck's involvement, but he was definitely complicit in selling it without disclosing its shady past. Satisfied, Chuck gave Ray a polite nod and walked away, leaving the salesman visibly shaken. That night, Chuck sat at his kitchen table poring over maps of the area around Odessa. The warehouses mentioned in the articles were located deep in the desert, far from prying eyes. If Victor Kane's operation was still active, those buildings would likely hold the answers Chuck sought, but infiltrating such a place wouldn't be easy. It required planning, precision, and a healthy dose of caution. Chuck knew better than to rush into danger blindly. He had faced enough adversaries in his lifetime to understand the importance of strategy. He began by gathering supplies, a flashlight, a sturdy pair of gloves, and a small toolkit for emergencies. Next, he studied satellite images of the warehouses, noting their layout and potential entry points. Most importantly, he prepared himself mentally. This wasn't Hollywood. There would be no stunt doubles or second takes. Every move he made had to count. As midnight approached, Chuck climbed into his truck and set off toward Odessa. The drive took him through barren stretches of land, where the only sounds were the hum of the engine and the occasional howl of the high wind. When he finally reached the outskirts of the industrial zone, he parked a safe distance away and continued on foot, moving silently beneath the cover of darkness. The first warehouse loomed ahead, its walls cracked and windows shattered. Chuck slipped inside, his senses on high alert. The interior was dimly lit by moonlight streaming through gaps in the roof, revealing rows of dusty machinery and discarded crates. At first glance, it seemed abandoned, but Chuck's instincts told him otherwise. He moved cautiously, scanning the area for signs of recent activity. It wasn't long before he found what he was looking for. Tucked away in a corner of the warehouse was a fleet of vehicles, each eerily similar to his own truck. Some were partially disassembled, while others bore fresh scratches and scuff marks. Chuck examined them closely, discovering hidden compartments identical to the one in his truck. These weren't ordinary modifications. They were designed with precision capable of concealing large quantities of goods without detection. Among the scattered tools and paperwork, Chuck stumbled upon blueprints detailing smuggling routes across Texas, New Mexico, and beyond. Names and dates were scribbled in the margins, along with instructions for coordinating pickups and drop-offs. One name stood out repeatedly: Victor Kane. It was clear that Kane's operation was vast, spanning multiple states and involving dozens of accomplices. Chuck snapped photos of the documents knowing they would serve as crucial evidence. As he prepared to leave, Chuck heard footsteps echoing in the distance. Someone else was in the warehouse. Crouching low, he retreated into the shadows, his heart pounding but his mind focused. Whoever these people were, they couldn't discover him. Not yet. There was still too much work to do. By the time Chuck returned home, dawn was breaking over the horizon. Exhausted but exhilarated, he spread the photos and notes across his kitchen table, piecing together the puzzle. The truck hadn't simply been a tool for smuggling. It was a key component of an intricate network orchestrated by Victor Kane. And now, thanks to Chuck's determination, the pieces were starting to fall into place. But this was only the beginning. Chuck knew that exposing Kane's operation would require more than just evidence. It would take courage, resolve, and a willingness to face whatever dangers lay ahead. As he stared out the window at the rising sun, Chuck felt a familiar fire ignite within him. Retirement might have promised him peace, but sometimes fate had other plans, and Chuck Norris wasn't one to shy away from a challenge. Armed with the evidence he had gathered from the warehouse, Chuck Norris knew his next steps would be critical. The documents and photos painted a clear picture of Victor Kane's sprawling smuggling empire, an operation that relied on modified vehicles like his truck to transport illegal goods across state lines. But exposing such a powerful crime lord wouldn't be easy. Kane wasn't just any criminal. He was a master manipulator who had evaded law enforcement for years, leaving behind only whispers and shadows. If Chuck wanted to bring him down, he'd need to act carefully and decisively. The first thing Chuck did was return to the library, where he spent hours poring over additional records and news articles about Kane. He learned that Kane operated under a veil of secrecy, rarely appearing in public or associating directly with his underlings. Instead, he orchestrated his schemes from afar, using intermediaries to carry out his orders. This made tracking him down nearly impossible unless you knew exactly where to look. Chuck also discovered that Kane maintained a luxurious ranch deep in the desert, a sprawling compound surrounded by high fences and guarded by armed men. It was both a fortress and a symbol of power, a place where Kane conducted business away from prying eyes. Chuck realized that confronting Kane directly would require more than just bravery. It demanded preparation. He began by mapping out the route to the ranch, studying satellite images to identify potential entry points and surveillance systems. He noted the locations of guard towers, patrol routes, and even the types of vehicles used by Kane's security team. Every detail mattered, and Chuck committed them all to memory, knowing that one wrong move could jeopardize everything. To further bolster his plan, Chuck decided to create a disguise. Using some old clothes and props he found around his house, he transformed himself into a rough-looking drifter, someone who might blend in with the kind of people drawn to Kane's underworld. He added a scruffy beard, dirtied his hands, and tucked a fake ID into his pocket. His goal was simple: pose as a potential buyer interested in joining Kane's smuggling ring. If he could gain access to the ranch, he might uncover enough evidence to dismantle the entire operation. Under the cover of night, Chuck loaded his truck with supplies and set off toward Kane's compound. The drive took him through desolate stretches of desert, where the only sounds were the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of wind-blown sand. As he approached the ranch, the landscape shifted dramatically. Lush greenery replaced barren earth, irrigated by underground water systems that kept Kane's property thriving despite the harsh surroundings. High gates loomed ahead, guarded by men armed with rifles. Chuck slowed the truck to a stop and rolled down his window, flashing a confident smile at the guards. "Name's Jake," he said gruffly, holding up the fake ID. "I'm here to see Mr. Kane." One of the guards squinted at the ID before nodding toward the gate. "You're expected," he said curtly, pressing a button that allowed Chuck to pass. Clearly, Kane's network had already vetted him, or at least whoever they thought he was. Inside the compound, the opulence was staggering. Expensive cars lined the driveway, and manicured gardens stretched as far as the eye could see. In the center stood the main house, a massive structure with marble columns and gleaming windows. Chuck parked his truck near a cluster of other vehicles, many of which looked eerily similar to his own. Hidden compartments, reinforced frames, and custom modifications were standard features here, proof that this was ground zero for Kane's smuggling operation. A burly man in a suit greeted Chuck at the door and escorted him inside. The interior of the house was equally lavish, with crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling and gold accents adorning every surface. Despite the grandeur, there was an air of menace that permeated the space. Armed guards lingered in corners, their eyes scanning the room for threats. Chuck remained calm, his demeanor relaxed but alert. He followed the man into a large office where Victor Kane sat behind a desk, flanked by two henchmen. Kane was older than Chuck had expected, with silver hair and sharp features that hinted at a lifetime of ruthlessness. His piercing gaze locked onto Chuck as he entered the room. "So you're Jake," Kane said, his voice smooth but laced with authority. "Tell me what brings you to my little corner of the world." Chuck leaned back in his chair, adopting the persona of a desperate opportunist. "I've heard rumors about your enterprises," he said cautiously. "Word is you've got the best setup in the business. I'm looking to expand my horizons, maybe join forces with someone who knows how to get things done." Kane studied him for a moment, clearly weighing whether to trust this newcomer. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Smart move coming to me," he said, leaning forward. "But let's be clear. I don't partner with amateurs. You'll need to prove yourself if you want a seat at the table." Over the next hour, Kane laid out the details of his operation, boasting about its efficiency and reach. He showed Chuck blueprints of smuggling routes, discussed methods for avoiding detection, and even hinted at plans to expand into new territories. Chuck listened intently, nodding along as though impressed, all while mentally cataloging every piece of information. When Kane finally excused him, promising to consider his request, Chuck left the office with a newfound sense of urgency. That night, Chuck returned to his hotel room where he reviewed everything he had learned. The evidence against Kane was damning: blueprints, vehicle modifications, and first-hand accounts of his plans, but it wasn't enough to take him down alone. Chuck needed help, and he knew exactly where to find it. Early the next morning, he drove to the nearest FBI field office carrying the photos, documents, and notes he had collected. The agents listened intently as Chuck explained his findings, their expressions shifting from skepticism to awe as he revealed the depth of Kane's crimes. With the FBI now involved, Chuck worked alongside them to execute a raid on Kane's compound. Agents disguised as workers infiltrated the ranch, gathering intelligence while Chuck coordinated from a safe distance. When the time came, helicopters descended from the sky, surrounding the property and cutting off escape routes. Guards scrambled to defend the compound, but they were no match for the combined force of federal agents and Chuck's tactical expertise. In the chaos, Chuck confronted Kane himself. The crime lord attempted to flee, slipping through secret passages and evading capture at every turn. But Chuck anticipated his moves, using his knowledge of the ranch's layout to corner him in a hidden bunker beneath the house. Surrounded and outnumbered, Kane finally surrendered, his face twisted with rage and disbelief. As dawn broke over the desert, the raid concluded with dozens of arrests and mountains of seized contraband. Victor Kane was taken into custody, his empire crumbling around him. For Chuck, the victory was bittersweet. He had hoped for a quiet retirement, but fate had intervened, pulling him back into a world of danger and intrigue. Still, he couldn't deny the satisfaction of knowing he had stopped a dangerous criminal from wreaking further havoc. Driving home in his battered truck, Chuck reflected on the journey that had led him here. What started as a simple trip to buy a used vehicle had turned into something far greater, a testament to his determination, resourcefulness, and unwavering commitment to justice. Though the road ahead promised peace and solitude, Chuck knew that part of him would always remain ready to answer the call when duty beckoned. After all, legends like Chuck Norris weren't defined by their battles. They were defined by the lives they touched and the good they brought into the world. The aftermath of the raid on Victor Kane's compound was nothing short of chaotic. Federal agents swarmed the property, confiscating weapons, counterfeit goods, and stacks of cash hidden in secret rooms beneath the mansion. Trucks like the one Chuck had purchased were towed away for further inspection, their hidden compartments revealing evidence of Kane's sprawling criminal network. The once impenetrable fortress now stood exposed, its secrets laid bare under the harsh light of justice. But while the FBI celebrated a significant victory, Chuck Norris knew the fight wasn't over yet. Victor Kane, handcuffed and seething with anger, was escorted to a waiting van. His usually calm demeanor had cracked, replaced by a mix of fury and desperation. As he passed Chuck, who stood nearby observing the scene, Kane stopped abruptly, his piercing eyes locking onto him. "You think this is over?" Kane spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You're just a man, Norris. A man can be broken." Chuck didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped closer, his expression calm but resolute. "It's not about breaking you," he said evenly. "It's about stopping you. And that's exactly what I've done." Kane sneered, shaking his head as if amused by the notion. "You don't understand how deep this goes. Take me out and someone else will rise to take my place. You've barely scratched the surface." Chuck studied Kane's face, searching for any hint of bluff or bravado. But there was something unsettlingly genuine in Kane's words, a quiet confidence that suggested he wasn't exaggerating. For all the arrests and seizures, Kane's empire might have been more extensive than anyone realized. It wasn't just about smuggling contraband, it was about power, influence, and control, and those things weren't easily dismantled. As the van carrying Kane pulled away, Chuck turned to Agent Harris, the lead investigator overseeing the case. "He's right about one thing," Chuck said, his tone serious. "This isn't just about Kane. We need to dig deeper, find out who else is involved." Harris nodded, though his expression betrayed a flicker of doubt. "We've got enough to put Kane away for life, but unraveling the entire network could take months, maybe years. These people are careful. They leave no paper trails, no loose ends." Chuck understood the challenge ahead, but he also knew they couldn't afford to stop now. If even a fragment of Kane's operation remained intact, it would only be a matter of time before another crime lord emerged to fill the void. Determined to see the job through, Chuck offered his assistance, vowing to help the FBI track down every last accomplice. Over the following weeks, Chuck worked tirelessly alongside the agents, analyzing data, cross-referencing names, and identifying key players within Kane's organization. They discovered that Kane's reach extended far beyond Texas, spanning multiple states and crossing international borders. Smuggling routes connected remote warehouses, docks, and airstrips, forming a complex web of illicit activity. Each node in the network represented a potential lead, and Chuck insisted on investigating them personally. One such location was an abandoned airfield outside Amarillo, where Kane's crew allegedly stored shipments before transporting them overseas. Chuck arrived at dawn, his truck kicking up clouds of dust as he approached the crumbling hangars. The place looked deserted, but Chuck's instincts told him otherwise. He parked a safe distance away and moved cautiously on foot, scanning the area for signs of movement. Inside one of the hangars, he found rows of crates stacked neatly against the walls. Some were labeled innocuously, farm equipment or medical supplies, but Chuck recognized the telltale signs of misdirection. Using a crowbar, he pried open one of the crates, revealing bundles of counterfeit currency wrapped in plastic. Nearby, another crate contained advanced weaponry, including assault rifles and ammunition. Clearly, this airfield served as a staging ground for Kane's most lucrative operations. As Chuck documented the findings, he noticed fresh tire tracks leading into the desert. Someone had been here recently, and they might still be close by. Grabbing his flashlight, Chuck followed the tracks, weaving between dunes until he spotted a group of men gathered around a jeep. They were loading supplies into the vehicle, oblivious to his presence. Chuck crouched low, listening intently to their conversation. "We need to move fast," one of them muttered. "With Kane gone, the feds will be breathing down our necks." "Don't worry," another replied confidently. "We've got backup plans. This isn't the end, it's just the beginning." Chuck's jaw tightened. These men weren't mere foot soldiers. They were high-ranking members of Kane's inner circle, tasked with keeping the operation alive even after their leader's arrest. Taking them down would deal a crippling blow to the network, but doing so required precision. Chuck waited until The men split up, then struck swiftly and silently, disabling two of them with calculated moves honed over decades of martial arts training. The third man reached for his gun, but Chuck disarmed him before he could fire, leaving all three incapacitated, but alive. Back at the FBI headquarters, Chuck shared his findings, providing crucial intel that led to additional arrests. Piece by piece, the network unraveled, exposing corrupt officials, rogue businessmen, and enforcers willing to do whatever it took to protect their interests. With each arrest, the shadowy world Kane had built began to crumble, its foundations weakened by relentless pursuit. But the true test came when Chuck uncovered evidence linking Kane's operation to a larger syndicate operating overseas. Documents seized from the airfield revealed communication logs detailing transactions with foreign buyers and suppliers. This wasn't just a domestic issue. It was part of a global conspiracy involving powerful figures who operated above the law. The implications were staggering, and Chuck knew the FBI alone couldn't handle it. He reached out to contacts in international law enforcement agencies, sharing information and coordinating efforts to dismantle the syndicate layer by layer. Throughout it all, Chuck maintained his focus, driven by a sense of duty that transcended personal gain. Though the work was exhausting and often dangerous, he never wavered. For every setback, there was a breakthrough. For every obstacle, a solution. And slowly but surely, the tide began to turn. By the time the final arrests were made, months had passed since Chuck first set out to uncover the truth behind his used truck. The journey had taken him from dusty car lots to hidden bunkers, from desolate airfields to bustling ports. Along the way, he had faced danger, deceit, and moments of doubt. But he had also proven that one person, armed with courage and determination, could make a difference. As he stood outside the courthouse on the day of Kane's sentencing, Chuck felt a profound sense of closure. The crime lord, once untouchable, was now behind bars, facing charges that would keep him imprisoned for life. His empire was gone, reduced to rubble by the combined efforts of law enforcement and one unlikely hero. Agent Harris approached Chuck, extending a hand. "You did good, Norris," he said sincerely. "We couldn't have done it without you." Chuck shook his hand firmly, offering a small smile. "It's not about me," he replied. "It's about making sure people like Kane can't hurt anyone else. That's what matters." With that, Chuck walked away, climbing into his battered truck and driving off into the sunset. The road ahead promised peace and simplicity, but Chuck knew he would always carry the lessons of this adventure with him. Life had a way of pulling you back into the fray when you least expected it. But for Chuck Norris, stepping up to meet the challenge was simply part of who he was. The dust settled over Pecos as life returned to its usual rhythm. The sun rose and set, casting long shadows over the quiet streets where neighbors exchanged friendly waves and children played in the yards. For most residents, the events surrounding Victor Kane's arrest were little more than headlines in the morning paper, a distant drama that had unfolded far beyond their small-town borders. But for Chuck Norris, the story wasn't just a memory. It was a reminder of how interconnected the world truly was, and how even the simplest decisions could ripple outward, affecting lives in ways no one could predict. Chuck had hoped that retirement would bring him peace, but his unexpected journey into the heart of danger left an indelible mark on him. He often found himself sitting on his porch at dusk, sipping coffee and reflecting on everything he'd seen and done. The truck, the same beat-up pickup that started it all, now sat parked in his driveway, silent and unassuming. Its hidden compartment had been dismantled by federal agents, leaving behind only faint scuff marks as evidence of its former purpose. To anyone else, it was just another old vehicle, worn down by time and miles. To Chuck, it symbolized something greater, the thin line between ordinary life and extraordinary circumstances. Word eventually spread about Chuck's role in taking down one of the largest smuggling rings in recent history. At first, it trickled through town as whispers among locals who recognized the cowboy-hatted man from the car lot. "Isn't that Chuck Norris?" they'd ask, pointing toward the ranch-style house on the edge of town. "The actor? What's he doing here?" As details emerged, how he'd uncovered Kane's operation, infiltrated the compound, and worked with the FBI. Stories began to circulate faster than tumbleweeds in a Texas windstorm. Some people joked about adding this tale to the long list of Chuck Norris legends, while others marveled at his humility and courage. One evening, a group of curious townsfolk gathered outside Chuck's home, hoping to catch a glimpse of the man who had single-handedly brought justice to their corner of the world. When Chuck stepped onto his porch, mug of coffee in hand, they erupted into applause. Startled but amused, Chuck tipped his hat and offered a warm smile. "Just glad I could help," he said simply before retreating inside, leaving his admirers buzzing with excitement. Despite the attention, Chuck remained grounded. Fame had never been what drove him. It was the desire to do what was right, whether it involved performing stunts on camera or confronting crime lords in the desert. In Pecos, he had found a community that appreciated him not for his celebrity status, but for the person he was, kind, thoughtful, and always willing to lend a hand. Whether it was helping a neighbor fix a fence or sharing stories around a campfire, Chuck fit seamlessly into the fabric of the town. But the truck still lingered in his thoughts. Though it had served its purpose, Chuck knew it couldn't stay in his possession, not after everything it represented. After some consideration, he decided to donate it to the local sheriff's department. With its reinforced frame and concealed compartments, it was perfect for training K-9 units to detect hidden contraband. On the day of the donation, Sheriff Daniels arrived at Chuck's house with a team of officers and a grateful handshake. "This'll make a real difference," Daniels said, patting the hood of the truck. "We can use it to teach our dogs how to sniff out trouble. You've done us a solid, Chuck." Chuck nodded, watching as the truck was loaded onto a flatbed trailer and driven away. As it disappeared down the road, he felt a sense of closure wash over him. The vehicle that had once carried secrets now carried hope, a tool for protecting others rather than endangering them. It was fitting, he thought, that something born out of deception could find new life and service. With the truck gone, Chuck turned his focus back to the simpler pleasures of life. He spent his days tending to his garden, fishing at the nearby lake, and volunteering at the community center. Yet every so often he'd pause during these activities, his mind drifting back to the lessons he'd learned along the way. The adventure had taught him that danger didn't always come wrapped in obvious packages. It could hide in plain sight, disguised as something mundane. It had also reminded him of the importance of trust, both in oneself and in others. Without the help of law enforcement and the courage of ordinary people standing up against injustice, Kane's empire might still be thriving. As weeks turned into months, Chuck noticed subtle changes in the town. Conversations shifted from gossip and speculation to discussions about safety and accountability. People became more vigilant, reporting suspicious activity and looking out for one another. Even the used car lot where Chuck had purchased the truck saw improvements. Ray, the salesman, had cleaned up his act, or at least tried to. Gone were the overly slick pitches and questionable deals. Instead, customers found transparency and honesty. Chuck stopped by occasionally, offering advice when needed and ensuring the dealership stayed on the right path. On one such visit, Ray approached him sheepishly, holding out a small wooden plaque engraved with the words, "Hero Among Us." "I know it doesn't make up for what happened," Ray admitted, scratching the back of his neck. "But I wanted to say thanks. You didn't have to help me, or any of us, but you did. And we're better off because of it." Chuck accepted the plaque with a chuckle, placing it on the dashboard of his new truck, a modest replacement he'd picked up at a trusted dealership. "Just remember," he told Ray, "every choice matters. Sometimes doing the right thing is harder, but it's always worth it." By the time winter rolled around, Pecos felt different, not dramatically so, but enough to notice. The air carried a renewed sense of optimism, and the bonds between neighbors grew stronger. Chuck, too, felt a deeper connection to the place he called home. He realized that heroism wasn't defined by grand gestures or larger-than-life feats. It was about making a difference, however small, in the lives of those around you. On Christmas Eve, the town held its annual holiday celebration in the park. Families gathered around bonfires, roasting marshmallows and singing carols under strings of twinkling lights. Chuck attended with a thermos of hot cocoa, joining in the festivities with a contented smile. At one point, a group of kids ran up to him, wide-eyed and giggling. "Are you really Chuck Norris?" one of them asked, clutching a dog-eared action figure. Chuck knelt down to their level, his voice gentle. "Sure am, partner. What can I do for you?" The kids erupted into laughter, bombarding him with questions about movies, martial arts, and whether he really could roundhouse kick someone into next week. Chuck answered each query with good humor, spinning tales that blurred the line between fact and fiction. By the time he stood up again, the crowd had grown, cheering and clapping as if welcoming a hometown hero. That night, as Chuck returned home and settled onto his porch, he gazed up at the star-filled sky. The universe stretched endlessly above him, vast and mysterious, much like the journey he'd embarked upon months earlier. He thought about the truck, the hidden compartment, and the tangled web of crime he'd unraveled. He thought about Victor, Kane, whose arrogance had blinded him to the power of integrity. And he thought about the people of Pecos, whose resilience and kindness inspired him daily. For all his fame and accomplishments, Chuck realized that some of the most meaningful victories came not from flashy stunts or dramatic showdowns, but from quiet acts of courage and compassion. Retirement hadn't given him the solitude he anticipated, but it had given him something far more valuable, a renewed sense of purpose. As the fireflies danced in the cool night air and the distant hum of crickets filled the silence, Chuck leaned, back in his chair, letting the moment wash over him. Life in Pecos was simple yet rich with meaning. It was a place where legends weren't just told, they were lived. And for Chuck Norris, there was no better place to call home.